I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters, the only weekly serialized sword and sorcery podcast in all of the Sundered Worlds. Not only do I write every episode myself, but I also record them myself, by myself, in one single, flawless take. It's completely DIY. This is the second episode of SKALD's 7th cycle. But you don't have to worry about going back to the previous episode, unless you want to. That's because each episode of SKALD is designed to be a perfect, intense entry point for new listeners. So go ahead and dive in here with the best episode yet. Afterward, you can go back to earlier episodes on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. You can pick up the prose volumes from Amazon, or you can just wait until next week when there will be a brand new episode waiting for you. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 98. Pyrrh sliced open his finger, and he winced, immediately drawing it to his mouth. But shortly thereafter, he thought better of it. He realized that Gira, even if she wasn't watching, she was there. She was in the room with him, and now, after having been so weak, so useless, so ineffectual, it was time that he at least acted strong. So he removed his finger, blood still weeping from a tiny scratch, and he returned to his work. As the storm receded into the distance, still tormenting his ears with those irregular, intermittent blasts of thunder, they had both set to work. Pyrrh was tired, was exhausted, was bruised, and was beaten, and all he wanted to do, all he felt that he could do, was collapse into a broken, heaving heap, collapse and try to sleep off the beating that the Malians had given him. But Gira was tireless. She was a font of energy, a wellspring of motivation, and after dragging the Malians' corpses out into the open to feed whatever scavengers might happen by, she had insisted that she get to work, that she repair their hovel's ruined door. And while Gira toiled, while she labored, while she worked to protect both of their safety, both of their futures, both of their dangerous dream, their perilous plan, what would Pyrrh do? Would he simply watch? Would he give her pointers? Would he drift off to sleep? Sleep, the very thing that had brought this trouble upon them? No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. And instead, he too would work. At first, he'd attempted to help Gira, to assist her in repairing the door, in reinforcing it with the large, flawless, rust-free chunks of metal that she had been collecting for months. The very materials that she needed, the very components necessary to enact their plan, to craft their weapon, to assassinate the tyrant Maul. But after he, exhausted, Too weak to be any help, after he dropped the second metal sheet, the one that Gira easily hoisted up with a single hand. She had turned to him, smiling sweetly, and she suggested that he help clean up her workbench. It was a gracious suggestion, a kind suggestion. Instead of telling him what he already knew, instead of telling him how worthless and weak and useless he was, how this entire situation was his fault, was a result of his failures, she pretended as if cleaning up her workbench was an actual necessary task and not just busy work assigned to keep him out of her way. He recognized her kindness. He appreciated it. But nonetheless, it tormented him. It burned him and it pained him to know that she knew the truth. She was too good for him. But with no other option, with no better option, he played along with the ruse. He agreed to her suggestion and set to work cleaning up her workbench, sorting its broken, ruined, and scattered components into piles. One for the broken pieces, one for the intact ones, and the largest pile, that which he could not identify or judge. He was worthless, truly worthless. He couldn't even perform this simple task, couldn't even help Gira clean up the mess that he had made. He hated himself. He loathed himself, and while castigating himself, he had sliced open his finger on the rough, jagged edge of he did not know what. Soon after, he was broken out of his reverie, distracted from his self-flagellation as he heard a heavy slam from behind him. There, it's done. Her voice rang out clear and bright, with none of the frustration or exhaustion that hung heavy around his head. He turned as quickly as he could, as quickly as his bruised, already stiffening body would allow him. She was right. She stood there, wiping her brow, proud of the sweat upon it, proud of the soot and the grease she smeared across it. She stood there in front of that door, and she was right. It was done. Her repairs were finished. And remarkably, the door wasn't just as good as it was before. It was better. After wielding her tools, the ones she now hefted across the hovel back toward Pyrrh and her workbench, after using a dismaying amount of metal reserves, of the supplies meant for her device, for her weapon, the door was reinforced, banded with iron, and even more sturdy than before. But Gira, Pyrrh spoke quietly, concerned. You use so much of your supplies. Gira placed her tools heavily upon the workbench, rattling the pointless piles that Pyrrh had been laboring over. It's fine. She smiled. There's no sense in doing anything halfway, my sweet. Pyrrh felt his stomach roil with guilt and shame. But you use so much. You won't have enough. There's not enough left. Gira looked around at what was left of her supplies. No, there's not. For now, it's more important that the door be sturdy, that it hold against any other attacks. Pyrrh ran his fingers through his limp hair, streaked with gray. But our plan, your plan, how will you craft your weapon? Gira looked up and smiled at Pyrrh. Our plan. And we'll have to go get more supplies, of course. Which is why the door needed to be stronger. She took his face in both hands and kissed his forehead. Because you're coming with me this time. Pyrrh stuttered. But I... Are you sure? Gira nodded toward the bedroll they shared. Of course I'm sure. Now come to bed. We have a big day ahead of us. We'll need to be well rested. As Gira blew out the sputtering candles around the hovel, Pyrrh burrowed down into the thin, worn blankets covering their bedroll, shivering despite the warmth that still radiated from the forge. Gira, whose blood ran hot and virile, stripped down and joined Pyrrh under the covers. Desperate for her warmth, for her vitality, for her strength, Pyrrh huddled up next to her. And he sighed deeply, partaking of the only happiness he had left, the only true happiness that he had ever known. And as he lay there, Gira kissed him, a kiss both gentle and firm, a kiss of an offering and a request as her soot-covered hands wrapped around his thin, gaunt body. I'm sorry, he spoke, ashamed. I'm so tired, so sore. I'm too useless to do anything but sleep. Even in the darkness, lit only by the glowing forge, Pyrrh could see her smile at him. My sweet, as long as you do it by my side, I'll be happy. The next morning, Pyrrh, his body aching, both from the Malian's attack as well as a night spent motionless, a night spent plummeting through a dreamless sleep. He woke. And when he did, he saw that Gira, sweet, strong, powerful Gira, was already awake and was already hard at work. She crouched near the forge in its radiating warmth, loading up a worn satchel with supplies, with food, with water, with her stone throwers, and with the tools and the equipment she used to maintain them. He lay there, warm underneath the blankets, watching her work, watching her take care of him, take care of both of them, watching her make plans and schemes, watching her hope and yearn for a better world. He watched her, silently, surreptitiously, until his eyes wandered up to the workbench and what lay upon it. The piles were still there. The heaped up mounds of iron and steel, of broken tools, of bent materials, of cogs and components that Pyrrh could not even describe, much less identify. But where before there had been 3 piles, the broken, the salvaged, and the unknown, now there were at least 6. Gira had been hard at work. Even as Pyrrh slept, had been hard at work, once again, cleaning up his mess, redoing the job that he had ruined, the work that he had failed to accomplish. But as the regret, the shame, and the hatred for himself, as it bubbled up inside of him, it suddenly dissipated. It disappeared as she, Gira, looked up at him with that soot-stained face and smiled. Good morning. I tried not to wake you. I know how tired you must be. Eager to prove himself, eager to be of some type of help, he forced himself out of the warmth of the bedroll, stretching his aching joints as he climbed to his feet. You should have woken me. We need to leave soon, don't we? She turned and retrieved something from near the fire. A plate loaded with roots, with leaves, and with a sad, shriveled, lonely fruit. Likely one of Gira's prize finds from the day before. Soon. But not immediately. Not before you've eaten. Pyrrh sat by the forge and picked at the plate's contents. He was never hungry in the mornings. He was never truly hungry. Never as hungry as he had once been as a younger man, as a stronger man, before he had drawn too heavily, drawn too deeply, before he had done too much. Do you know what you need? Gira nodded as she looked over her supplies, over what remained of them. And for an almost imperceptible moment, he saw her smile, that mask of warmth and happiness and confidence. He saw it falter. But just as quickly, the edges of her mouth turned upward once again. Yes, and it's doable. The scrapyard will have it. Pyrrh forced down the rest of the food, knowing that he'd regret it later if he didn't. How are we going to get it, though? Lest won't give us anything else on credit. Gira smiled as she loaded food, far more than they would need, into her satchel. But he might, on a barter. We've got enough to spare, and failing that, she lifted her dual stone throwers with a sad sense of pride. I have these. Pyrrh was aghast. What? Gira, no. You built those yourself, by hand. He wouldn't appreciate them. He probably wouldn't even clean them. They'd break within a month. Gira began loading up the satchel. Good. Then I'll make another pair, and I'll trade him those too. Pyrrh put his hand on her arm, hoping to stop her, to convince her to keep her weapons, to keep the only thing that had saved them from the Malians. Gira, don't. Gira turned and spoke curtly to her lover. No, Pyrrh. You've made your sacrifices. The gods know you have. And now? She cinched the satchel shut. It's time that I do the same. The journey to Lest's scrapyard was an easy one. But Pyrrh had known that it would be. After an hour on the plains, an hour spent picking through the resilient brush that had made its home in the ashes that covered their world, the rest of the way was all downhill. The most difficult thing was to not move too fast, to not barrel down those rocky outcroppings, causing unnecessary strain on his creaking knees. The way there was easy, but the way back, it would be anything but. And Pyrrh shuddered to think of how difficult it would be to pull himself back up those rocks, and worst of all, of how embarrassed he would be to once again have to lean on her, to lean on his beloved Pyrrh. But that was a struggle for another time. It was a trial with which he was already intimately familiar. And now they had another challenge ahead of them, because they had arrived at the scrapyard. Lest was open for business. He was hungry for business. He was, as always, simply hungry. So they had no trouble getting through his gates, didn't even get hassled by his mouth-breathing sons and the vicious dogs they kept on heavy chains. No. Challenge, the true challenge, would come from the negotiation. Lest listened as Gira rattled off what she needed. He nodded in the affirmative to each item, each necessary component of Gira's designs. He nodded slowly, but nonetheless it was fast enough that it set his fleshy jowls quivering. And when she finished, when she had given him the entire list, he ran his stubby fingers over the stubble that covered his head, and he licked his puffy, chapped lips. I have it all. I have exactly what you need. But what, pray tell? He flashed a grin, unashamed of the blackened, decaying teeth that filled his head. What do you have for me? Gira began to pull things out of her satchel. Roots, leaves, gnarled root vegetables, even a few shriveled fruits. Food, freshly foraged. We have lest emitted a sound that was less a laugh and more like the braying of a donkey. Food! You call that food? What do I look like to you? A rabbit? Pyrrh fought the urge to answer Lest's question, to tell him exactly what he looked like. The scrapyard owner had a legendary temper, and his dogs a legendary hunger, and besides, they needed supplies more than he needed the satisfaction of telling off that disgusting old monster. Gira, in control as always, remained calm. Lest, you know we don't eat meat. We find it too delicious, too savory, too wonderful. Lest began to laugh. Or, I know, too expensive, too pricey for the likes of you two. Gira continued, undeterred. Certainly, meat isn't all that you eat, is it? Lest leaned over his counter, close enough that Pyrrh could smell the fetid stench on his breath, Verification that the words Lest spoke were true. Of course, it's all that I eat. It's all that is worth eating in this forsaken world. And even if you had brought me flesh, brought me some poor excuse for meat, what good would it even be? Lest laughed, his exposed belly jiggling as he did. My pens are already full to bursting. Gira, her initial offer rebuffed, with no other options. She breathed deeply. She came to grips with what she was about to give up, the sense of safety and security that she was going to willingly hand over to a monster like Lest, the leverage that she would willingly give up. She accepted it as a necessity. And then she did it. Slowly, she reached into her satchel and removed the finest weapons she had ever made. Her dual stone throwers. What about these, then? Lest allowed a slow smile to creep across his broad, boil-covered face. Stone throwers. Gira grinned back. Yes, my own design. They're exquisite. One, or rather two, of a kind. Lest picked up one of the weapons and he inspected it closely. Now, how many stones do they hold? Gira opened the chamber for him. 3 each. That's 2 more than any of those hack tinkerers have managed. Lest laid the stone thrower back down on the counter. Well, I guess it's a good thing then. Proudly, disdainfully, he then threw back the long, open robe that he wore, revealing a pair of crude, hateful-looking stone throwers of his own. It's a good thing that I don't deal with any hack tinkerers. Mine hold 4. Gira was taken aback. But how? I've never seen any more than one. The functionality of... Lest produced one of his stone throwers, and he held it proudly. Because these were made for me. They're only made for me. By my boys, smart boys, brilliant boys. Comes from all the meat. Gira shook her head. It's impossible. The size of it would jam. It would have to. Lest slid Gira's stone throwers back across the counter to her. Is that what you think? He grinned viciously. Then maybe a competition is in order. A duel. They were lucky that Pyrrh wasn't the one doing the negotiating. They were all lucky, because in a moment, in an instant, he would have taken that leering, disgusting monster up on his offer. Or rather, he wouldn't. He wouldn't have waited. He would have simply raised the weapon and unloaded it in Lest's bare, flabby chest. Who needs 4 stones? Who even needs 3? All he needed was the one that would burrow down into those rolls of fat and smash into Lest's blackened heart. That was if Pyrrh had been in charge. But fortunately, he was not. Gira sighed. Lest, please, how much business have we done with you over the years? And how much credit have I already extended to you? I'm not running a charity here. He smashed his fleshy fist down upon the counter. I know, Lest. I know. But certainly there's something you want. Something you would trade for. Something we could get for you. Pyrrh pleaded with him, flashing the smile that always made Pyrrh melt with emotion, with longing, with love, and with regret, whether it was a smile made for him or not. Lest thought for a moment, for a long, pregnant, silent moment. And then he spoke. The meat in my pens. It's delicious. It's the best. But I sometimes tire of it. I sometimes long for something more rare, more refined. Pyrrh began to feel his stomach twist into knots as he realized what Lest's request would entail. He was furious. He felt an undeniable rage build up inside of him. Anger at this fiend, this monster, who would ask that of them, who would, instead of working with them, instead of cooperating for not just their good, not just everyone's good, but even for the good of him and his family, who would instead send them on horrific errands. But Lest wasn't the only target of Pyrrh's rage. No, far from it, because he had more than enough fury left for himself, left for the weak, broken, old before his time failure who could do nothing to help the proud, beautiful, brilliant, powerful woman by his side. Pyrrh was furious. He was seething, but Gira, she was undeterred. What is it, Lest? What do you want? Lest closed his robe, a pretense of modesty and dignity. I want a goat. A wild goat from the mountains. Gira laughed. She couldn't help it, because the request, it was absurd. A goat? Lest, you know that's impossible. You can't find a goat anywhere outside of a musty old book. They don't exist, not anymore. She flashed another of those smiles, an attempt to weaken Lest's resolve, to soften him. You. Lest swallowed hard, clearly affected by Gira's smile, by her appearance, by the way she had leaned in and gently touched his hand. You better hope that you're wrong, or else. He leaned forward and looked down, leering at Gira's thighs, her thick, muscular legs. Or else, find something else delicious to offer me. You're very robust for a root chewer. Then, licking his lips, he reached up to touch Gira's hair, the heavy curls that hung down by her face, and he began to whisper some unheard obscenity. Enough! Pyrrh roared in a voice that he had forgotten he had, a voice that started down below his stomach, that issued forth from a place of rage and resentment and power, that rumbled up through his body before erupting out of his mouth. Enough! Tired of being useless, tired of being a failure, tired of ruining everything around him, including himself, he took Gira by the arm and pulled her away from Lest. We'll get you your goat. We'll bring it back here. but we will not kill it. That blood is on your hands. Pyrrh clenched his fist, hearing the call, hearing the offer of strength and power and magic that was made to him, the offer that was there waiting if he would but reach out and accept it, would reach out and accept what it would cost him. He clenched his fist and he denied that offer, denied the magic that ached to be let loose through him. We'll bring it back, and you will give us what we need, or you will see what a root chewer can do when pushed. Thanks for listening to the very best episode of SKALD yet. Each week, I read a review that SKALD has received on iTunes. I do this to encourage you to go do the same, as good reviews are the absolute best way to get this show seen and, well, heard by more people. Rich Crawl says, Tuesdays don't come soon enough. I started listening to SKALD after hearing Aubrey read his stories on another podcast. I began at the beginning and have only now caught up to the new episodes, and I must say that I will not know what to do with myself, having to wait a week to hear the next part of this tale. The story of the Sundered Worlds is one of rage and violence, and is a must-listen for anyone who likes sword and sorcery or fantasy in general. The bards of old would be proud to know their tradition is being kept alive in this modern medium. This episode of SKALD, like every episode of SKALD, is brought to you through the support of my Patreon donors. By going to patreon.com/SKALD, you can help support the only story that matters by pledging a few bucks a month. And best of all, by pledging, you get access to a slew of rewards, including 6 brand new ones. At the $3 level, for instance, I'll add your name to the list of Patreon supporters I have publicly posted on aubreysitterson.com. It's like that wall you always walk by at the museum, but for only $3 instead of, I don't know, a gajillion. Plus, you'll also get the recommended reading reward from the $2 level. Head to patreon.com/SKALD to sign up today. For more information on me, the SKALD prose volumes, my comic book writing, signed copies of my work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my bio, contact information, social media, and more, get yourself to aubreysitterson.com. This week's recommendation is another self-serving one, but it's something you need to know about. G.I. Joe #2 is on sale now. Right this very second in local comic shops or digitally on Comixology.com. Just follow the link in the description to find it and the rest of the series. Obviously, my G.I. Joe is very different from SKALD, but a lot of what you love about the only story that matters is on display there, including biting dialogue, complex characters, heavily serialized elements, and tons of action that definitely heavily involve laser guns and a transformer. Go buy it today. You'll get an awesome comic and you'll be supporting me in the process. It's win-win. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.